Good evening. It's really lovely to be with you this evening. So my name's Delyth and I'm a member of the Senedd, so the Welsh Parliament. I've been a member of the Senedd for around 2.5 years, and I was our international affairs spokesperson when Brexit happened, and now I am our climate change spokesperson. So I'll keep that brief because I've got lots to say in response to our first question, but I'm delighted to be with you this evening.
Thank you very much, Delyth, and we're delighted to have you. And Chris Bambery, who I'm sure many of you have come across through his work with many of you, particularly on the All-Party Parliamentary Group, and his books and writings and so on. So, Chris, please.
Yeah, I'm an author of a number of books, co-author of Catalonia Reborn with George Caravan, and author of A People's History of Scotland, which I'm quite proud of. I'm also an activist during the referendum campaign in 2014, in particular with the Radical Independence campaign, giving a bit more of an edge to the campaign, I think, in terms of putting forward an alternative. So, yeah, that's me.
Thank you very much. If we can move forward, so I'm going to start with an opening question for Delyth, and Delyth, when you start answering, I'll pull up your file and share that in a second. So first question, just to kick us off. So from a relatively low base of around 15% before 2015, support for the Welsh independence has been rapidly rising in the last few years, with YouGov poll in November 2020 showing a 33% support, and another in March 2021 showing 39% support. So what do you attribute this rise in support to in Wales? And are there any lessons you think that might be able to be learned for Catalans and other progressive independence movements?
Thank you so much, Mike. So I'd like to start by showing you a photograph that Mike is going to call up in a moment. It was a photograph taken on the 7th of September 2019 in the Merthyr Independence March. Now, 2019 was a watershed year. It was when the All Under One Banner marches began happening in Wales, first in Cardiff, then in Caernarfon, and then in Merthyr. Now, when you'll see this photograph, there were 5,000 people who came to that march. In the context of when we're talking about Catalonia, that is a drop in the ocean. But for Wales, this was an incredibly significant moment. It would have been even more had they put on enough trains from Cardiff up to Merthyr and had not, and probably 1,000 people been stranded down in Cardiff who wanted to come up. But there we are. It was the first moment that when I'd been able to visualize a nation that was actually on the march. Thank you very much for sharing that, Mike. Then in early 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic struck the world, and all of the marches that had been planned for 2020 obviously had to be put on hold. And there was this fear that the momentum that had been fizzling in the independence movement in Wales, that it would be lost. But COVID, ironically enough, has actually been in many ways a catalyst for the independence movement. I wanted to talk a little bit about why that was. There are quite a lot of reasons for this. So let me take you back to March 2020, when Boris Johnson announced, as he put it, it was going to be a national lockdown. And the chief medical officer was quoted as saying lots of things in the newspapers. Now, for many years, I mean, for as long as I've been born and decades before it, we've all in Wales become very used to this idea that London newspapers, even the BBC, refer to Matt Hancock as the health secretary, never the English health secretary, just the health secretary. And we've become used to headlines that announce policy developments that only affect England being announced as though they pertain to all of the UK. Now, we'll be hearing from Chris later about what developments in Scotland. And Scotland is very different from Wales in many ways. I'm sure more will come out about this in the conversation afterwards too. But one of the principal manifestations of that difference is the differing media landscapes. Now, in Scotland, there is a thriving Scottish media. You've got Scottish newspapers, even Scottish editions of the London papers. In Wales, that doesn't happen. Some stark statistics actually bring this out. So 6% of people in Wales get their news source from a Welsh news source. The equivalent figure in Scotland is 46%. So it's a really big difference there. The result of that is actually that we've got a significant democratic deficit. So people aren't aware of who is making the decisions that affect their lives. Sometimes they don't know what those decisions are. And that's not helped by newspapers that make these announcements saying that, you know, Gavin Williamson is the education secretary. He's only for England. Yeah. So COVID forced a change in that because it quickly became apparent that these misleading and quite lazy headlines and the reporting, it was no longer just confusing. It was actually a matter of danger to public health, because as the pandemic progressed and policy interventions were diverging more and more between Wales and England, I mean, we kept the stay-at-home message for a lot longer in Wales than in England. People couldn't cross the border. And so giving out information that wasn't relevant anymore, it could actually endanger people's health. And the newspapers and the broadcasters had to start inserting in England into their copy. And I know that might seem like a really small thing, but it was a revelation for us in Wales. The Welsh Government Twitter account started to troll newspapers on their Twitters by saying, oh, this doesn't affect Wales, and people would be retweeting this and they'd be engaging. And suddenly devolution was at the forefront of people's minds in a way it hadn't been probably any time since 1999. So there's a lot further that we need to go with broadcasting in Wales. I don't think it's a coincidence that we're talking, Mike, about these rise in support for independence over the past few years. Two news sources, one, The Nation, Nation.Cymru and The National, have both been launched in the past few years as well. I think that there is a correspondence between, there are corresponding things between the two then. And Welsh awareness of our own identity is on the rise, an awareness of that identity that is distinct from English identity in terms of policy and legislatures, because reporting matters. The stories we read, the stories we watch, they're meant to tell us something about our lives, that they form a part of the patchwork of identity. That's why regional news stations in different parts of England will have slightly different characters, because it's we see the stories that are meant to be reflecting back our own lives. And the fact that for so long in Wales, we received almost all of our news coverage through a lens that made us the other, that had an impact on the national psyche, on the collective consciousness almost. So that was one of the ways in which the pandemic has changed things. I think it's really significant. Now, another way in which the pandemic has increased support for independence is because of policy priorities or government priorities. It's become very apparent at various junctures during the past year that Wales has not been very high up the priority list for Westminster. I think there was a period between May and July of last year when Boris Johnson apparently did not pick up the phone to Mark Drakeford, the Welsh First Minister. That there was a period of very, very, very many weeks. It stretched into months. And there were reports that NHS England had gazumped thousands of tests that were meant to be for the Welsh government. And it took months for all of this to actually come out properly. And then in November, there was a fire break. So if you remember, each of the chief medical officers of the UK towards November had been, in September, had been recommending a mini lockdown or a fire break. And the situation was particularly grave in Wales. So the Welsh government said we were going into a fire break. And they requested from the Treasury that the Treasury extend the furlough scheme. And the Treasury refused. 2 weeks later, the situation got very bad in London and the southeast. England went into lockdown, and lo and behold, the furlough scheme was extended, but it was too late for the Welsh workers who'd already, many of them, lost their jobs because the scheme had not been extended to them because apparently their jobs were not as important. So far from stifling this movement for independence, COVID has actually been almost like a catapult because it's exposed so many injustices and kind of these points in which it's so obvious where we are not on the priority list. But I think one of the lessons I'd like the people from Catalonia to, and other independence movements, to take from what's happening in Wales is how crucial it is that there is a movement that's outside of party politics that is leading the whole thing. Yes, Cymru has seen its membership rise from something like 2,500 at the beginning of last year to nearly 20,000 today. I mean, the Merthyr Independence March that I showed you the photograph of, that wasn't led by Plaid Cymru. I was one of the speakers, but every other speaker was not associated with a political party. And more than anything, I mean, going back to that photograph, the independence movement in Wales, it's characterized by hope. It's not characterized, people don't march against something, they are marching in favor of something because they are motivated by a belief. I think that's really powerful. And I know that that's what motivates the Catalan independence movement too, but of course you are hindered by a particularly draconian response of the Spanish authorities, which obviously makes it a very different character. But please take courage, the world is still watching, you are shining light to all of us. Now, the final point I'd like to make, Mike, is the biggest change that's probably come about over the past year in Wales is that the idea of independence is no longer a sideshow. When I worked in Westminster a decade ago, the way that independence support was reported for Wales was around 6%. It was very dispiriting. And there's this brilliant quotation by the late great historian Gwynalf Williams. He's talking about Owain Glyndŵr and the uprising in the 15th century. And he said, since 1410, most Welsh people, most of the time, have abandoned any idea of independence as unthinkable. But since 1410, most Welsh people, at some time or another, if only in some secret corner of the mind, have been out there with Owain and his barefoot scrubs. For the Welsh mind is still haunted by that lightning flash vision of a people that was free. I can never say that without it catching in my throat. It's such a beautiful quotation, but that was written over 30 years ago. And something has changed. It's that one word, unthinkable. Even people who are furiously opposed to the idea of independence cannot now say it is unthinkable. Now, Catalonia, of course, is different. Like Scotland, and we'll be hearing from Chris, Catalonia has a long history as a proud and independent kingdom. So the very concept of it being unthinkable, that was never the same for, but it was never the same for Catalonia or Scotland. But in Wales, as I told you, for so long, we have shared institutions, but our ways of looking at ourselves have been through the prism of Englishness, not Britishness, but Englishness, because the narratives are written from England. And there was a dismissiveness that bordered on contempt for the idea of things that were Welsh. And the best example of this, I promise I'm coming to an end in a moment, Mike, the best example of this is there is a cultural festival that happens every year in Wales called the Eisteddfod. And it's the largest cultural festival that happens yearly in all of Europe. And it is never talked about in the London papers. You know, the BBC, they will send correspondents up to the Edinburgh Fringe for all of August sometimes, but they never talk about the Eisteddfod, even though it has such a rich tradition. I think the only time I remember it being reported on was in 2015. There was a piece on Newsnight, and the whole piece was saying, oh, the Eisteddfod's happening. Is Welsh a waste of money? Now, I can't think of many other languages at least that have to fight so hard to justify their own existence. But that's, I digress. That's where we've come from. That would not be thinkable to do now in quite the same way. And it's only 6 years later. I think the past year has changed things unalterably, but we ourselves in a different way are at a crossroads. I wonder what's going to happen. We'll be hearing from Chris about the situation in Scotland. The plea I would make is I don't want what happens to Wales to be determined by default because of what happens elsewhere. Now, I look on with hope and envy and trepidation, but beyond all, with belief at what is happening with our Celtic cousin in Scotland. But to bastardize the Philip Larkin line, here, I don't want any elsewhere to have to underwrite or justify our existence. So I want what happens to be for the good of all of the UK, for goodness sake, and for the good of England, although it's not often reported on in that way. So I look forward to what Chris has to tell us, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation afterwards. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Delyth. That was very insightful, and I think a lot of Catalans will certainly pick up on the some of the similarities, certainly on the cultural and language side, which is a very important part of the Catalan struggle. So if we could move to Chris now, 1 second, and I will share the question we have for Chris. I hope. Okay, so if you can see my screen. So the question for Chris, which is quite a heavyweight one, but I'm sure Chris is well able for it. So in your book, you say that the chief dramatis personae in the Catalan push for independence in October 2017 were the tens of thousands of excited Catalans who waited expectantly in Ciutadella Park that Friday afternoon to witness the birth of their new republic announced to the world. Given the recent electoral successes for both the Scottish and Catalan independence parties, how would you assess the current ability of the elected politicians to deliver independence for Scotland and/or Catalonia?
Okay, let's start by saying about the quote. The quote referred to the Declaration of Independence, which was a virtual declaration of independence. And unfortunately, the politicians who voted that day went away for the weekend. The Spanish state didn't go away for the weekend. They acted immediately with real shock and awe. And I think what saved the day, really, in Catalonia was the grassroots movement, and in particular, the Catalan National Assembly, by continuing to be on the streets and continuing to mobilize. It ensured that really the situation was saved. Now, I want to come to the Scotland and Catalonia. Scotland has similarities with Catalonia, but also differences. And the most obvious difference is that whatever the Catalan Parliament votes, the Catalan Parliament and the Catalan people are blocked by the Spanish Constitution from holding an independence referendum. Clearly, that was not the case in Scotland in 2014, when a referendum was held, agreed by the Scottish government and the Westminster government of David Cameron at the time. Although we should remember, David Cameron expected the no vote to win that referendum convincingly and finish off the issue for many years. Not quite what happened. But there is a similarity in the situation today. It's hard to see any Spanish government giving Catalonia a referendum, especially in the current situation with the rise of Vox, with the Popular Party in Madrid winning on a very right-wing ticket. Very hard to see that happening. But here in Scotland, despite the pro-independence SNP and Greens winning a majority of seats in the Scottish elections recently, the Conservative government of Boris Johnson has made it clear it is not going to give the mandate, give an agreement for a referendum. And without Westminster doing so, there can be no legal second referendum. And in that situation, I think there's a lack of strategy, to be perfectly honest, about how we move forward. Personally, I think we need to follow the Catalan example of mass mobilization, what Delyth was talking about. I think, yes, Cymru or the ANC in Catalonia don't actually really have an equivalent in Scotland. All Under One Banner has organized big marches, but it doesn't go beyond that. And eventually, there has to be a limit to how many times you can march. And there's a frustration, which I think has been shared at different points in time in Catalonia. It's a bit different. In Catalonia, I think it's more about the infighting which existed between the pro-independence parties. But there's a frustration that there doesn't seem to be a strategy for getting an independence referendum, apart from asking Westminster to deliver it. And at the same time, we have to be clear that the Scottish National Party government has moved in a more neoliberal direction, and is seen to have put independence on the back shelf. Whether that's right or wrong, that is a belief among our conservative activists. So I then just want to very quickly talk about Scotland and make some comparisons, if I may. Scotland's position inside the UK differs from that of Wales and Spain and Catalonia inside Spain. Wales and Catalonia were conquered. They were physically incorporated into that union. Scotland entered into a union by agreement. There was much opposition to it, as you may know, in 1707, the Union of the Parliaments. But the position of Scotland in the United Kingdom is very different from that of Catalonia. For instance, no Catalan has been Prime Minister of Spain, apart from one during the brief 1874 Republic. No Catalan. Now, that's not the case of Scots. We've had many Scottish Prime Ministers of Britain. On a wider scale, if you recall, Catalonia was barred from trading with the Castilian Empire until the close of the 18th century. After the Union of Parliaments and the creation of the United Kingdom, Scotland wasn't just the Scottish elite, weren't just a junior partner in the creation of empire. They were actually at the cutting edge of empire. You know, in India in particular, they were really to the fore. And I would argue, with the exception of the destruction of a Gaelic society in the Highlands, largely carried out by lowland Scots in the beginning of the 19th century with the clearances, there's not the same element of national oppression which Catalonia or indeed Wales around the language has suffered as a consequence of all this. And for much of modern Scottish history, particularly in the 19th, early 20th century history, it was quite easy to have a Scottish identity, but also have a British identity. What changed that is the decline of the United Kingdom, beginning really with the end of the First World War. A decline which has continued with no possibility, I think, of reversing that. It led to the beginnings of a national movement in the 1930s and really began to gather speed into the 1970s and 1980s. I would quickly argue that, until the mid-1980s and Thatcher's defeat of the working class, for instance, there had been a united working class across Wales, England, and Ireland. I'm not saying that's in Scotland. There were differences. But the defeats, particularly of the miners' strike in 1984-85, led ordinary people in Scotland to begin to look towards the creation of a Scottish Parliament as a shield against the aspects of Thatcherism they did not like and hadn't voted for. They got that Parliament under New Labour, although we now know Tony Blair was not at all keen in giving Scotland a devolution. And then what happened was the experience of the Tony Blair and Gordon Brown governments, the Iraq War, the love affair with the City of London, I can keep going through it all, led many people in Scotland then to turn around and say, and it gathers speed with the financial crash of 2008, having secured a Scottish Parliament, we can now see there is an escape pod from which we can escape the United Kingdom. Independence. And it was like, if you like, a natural progression, but the consequence was that huge sections of the Scottish population gathered to that. Now, it's worth saying at the beginning of the referendum, support for independence in Scotland was about the same as where it is at Wales now. The experience of the referendum, which didn't start very well, for those with a memory, the Alistair Darling debate around the currency question was a car crash for the referendum campaign. That's when, and I mentioned it, a more radical edge began developing into it, which particularly hit into the poorer sections of the Scottish population who probably wouldn't have voted. And to be fair, all sections of the independence movement began talking about, in an independent Scotland, we could rebuild industry. In an independent Scotland, we could address climate change. In an independent Scotland, we can get rid of Trident. We can break with this cycle of war and alliance with America that Britain seems trapped in. We can break for the whole control of the City of London and that revolving door between the Bank of England, the Treasury, and the finance ministry. And that had an effect on really shifting, as I say, mobilizing opinion. And for me, the support for independence is about democracy. It's about having governments that we elect, not governments we don't elect. And Westminster still has considerable power over what happens in Scotland. And it's about creating a fairer society. And I think that's very similar to what exists in Catalonia and very similar to what exists in Wales. Personally, I don't define myself as a nationalist because in this day and age, the connotations associated with the word, particularly in Europe at the moment, with the rise of right-wing anti-migrant, anti-Islamic nationalism, I don't use that. But I do say I'm pro-independence because of those reasons in terms of that. And that's why I have to say I'm slightly worried about the direction of the Scottish government in beginning to move in that neoliberal direction, because it doesn't open up a vision that we had in 2014, which appeals to ordinary people. The Growth Commission, which you may have heard of, is a particularly worrying development, because this was an opportunity to discuss a blueprint for having a state investment bank, which exists on paper, for putting in real measures. Instead, it seemed to be conceding that there would be problems with the budget after independence. There have to be a certain amount of cutbacks in spending after independence. This is exactly what we don't want to hear. You know, we want to hear that the NHS in Scotland, which is devolved as in Wales, is going to be boosted and move on. But, and I want to end on this. I think the reason I will remain hopeful, and am hopeful, despite having raised some issues here, is that there is a bit of a difference between the Spanish state and the UK state. There's many similarities, but this constant slide of decline, really since 1918, which was never reversed by Thatcher, never reversed by Blair. The results of that, this overdependence on finance, overdependence on the city of London, this constant free market agenda, which is being posed at full costs. Ironically, Boris Johnson is doing quite well in England because of the vaccination program. Vaccination program, of course, has been run by the National Health Service. Left to themselves, we remember the track and tracing fiasco when the Tories wanted privateers to take it over and run it. It's that decline of the UK state which more or less guarantees, I think, the issue is just going to keep coming up. And while I agree with Delyth, we have to work in our own nations for our own agenda. Watching what's happening in Ireland, there is clearly momentous things happening. And I have to say, I believe it's a question of which is going to come first here, whether Scotland will achieve independence or will get a united Ireland. But the consequences of that will kick in too. Let's just say Ireland goes first. It will kick into Scotland big time. And it will create a huge, given the quite close links which exist, will kick in. It will have its effects in Wales as well. So my argument would be there's a difference there in the sense that, you know, Spain, the huge problems of its democratic deficit, the huge problems of the flawed transition to democracy, the authoritarianism built into the judicial system and elsewhere, it doesn't quite suffer from that cycle of decline, which we've seen in the UK state. And that is a driving force, I believe, in both Wales, Scotland, and Ireland for independence or for Irish unity. So I'll finish there. I think you have to unmute yourself, Mike.
Thank you very much, Chris. Yeah, thank you very much. That was really really interesting. I'm sure lots of things there that chime with people in Catalonia and of course in Wales. So if we can move to have a Patrick Vidal, I believe you have a question. Let me just unmute you.
Yes, good evening, everyone. Yes, I have a question for both Corinne and Delyth. Well, really related to question. But first, well, I have a feeling that in spite of the problems, the Catalan language is in a better state than Welsh and Scottish language. My question is, what you think that what will be, according to you, the politics to apply, to lead, to impulse, to recover a good health for Welsh and Scottish language? That's my first question. And then my second question, well, it is often said that it is often talked about the agreement between Edinburgh and London for the Scottish independence referendum in 2014. But my opinion is that London, with David Cameron, had accepted the referendum because David Cameron thought that the no would won easily. Finally, the no won, but not as easily as he thought. And actually, Boris Johnson is refusing a second referendum because surely he's supposing that the victory would be for the yes.
Okay,
What do you think?
could I just, just to get to the key questions, if you could, please. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I finished.
Okay, so the questions particularly were, I think, the how the language and in particular, what was your point there? Just quickly in one sentence.
It's about the good health. What policies would help promote good health of the languages? Yeah.
Thank you.
Chris, should I go first on
yes,
on
you
that
go,
one?
because,
yeah. So in Wales, Chris made the really important point earlier that the situation with Scotland is different from Catalonia and from Wales because Scotland entered into an active union. In Wales, there was never an active union, there was an act of annexation. And in the act of annexation then, even in the legislation that was written down, it was specified that Welsh should be discouraged from being used. So we're going back centuries of Welsh being actively discouraged. It was literally beaten out of children for a long time. There was something called the Welsh knot, that was a piece of wood that was put around a child's head, and if you were caught in school speaking Welsh, you'd have it put around your head, and then you would be encouraged to go and find which other children were speaking Welsh, and if you then you put it on their head, whoever was wearing it at the end of the day would be beaten. So it was literally beaten out of people. So over the 20th century, certainly since the 1960s, there's been a resurgence of Welsh medium education. Actually, the number of Welsh speakers is relatively thriving. There's a target that the Welsh government has of reaching 1 million Welsh speakers by 2050, which is a great target. More needs to be done. So to answer your question, Patrick, in order to get good health for the Welsh language, there's already relatively good health, but we need to find policies of encouraging bilingualism in workplaces, of encouraging more Welsh medium education and normalising the use of Welsh in all parts of Wales, and trying to get people to feel an ownership of it, an affinity with the language, even if you don't speak it. That would be my.
I want to come in on one point which I think is really important for a lesson from Catalonia, which is right at the beginning of the autonomous government back in 1980. The Catalan government decided to use public state money to build up a Catalan language media, in this case, Catalan television. And they were not stupid. They knew they couldn't compete with Castilian soap operas, the football, etc. And they went in for a certain niche area. And I think that then expanded into the net. I mean, .cat was one of the first ever, and they managed to build up a very good virtual presence. And I say this because I think it's important for the language. We can't rely on the Rupert Murdochs of the BBC to help us on the language question. I think it's important overall, if we were to move towards independence, I would argue that's one of the things a Welsh or Scottish independent state would have to do, because otherwise we'd just be flooded out by English language TV, English language soap operas elsewhere. So I think it's very important we take that lesson from Catalonia. And we effectively don't have a language issue apart from the very small section of the population who continue to speak Gaelic. And that is a consequence, as I said, of one of the destruction of a Gaelic society largely carried out by Scots, Lowland Scots, evicting people from the Scottish Highlands to replace them with sheep in order to drive them onto the immigration boats or into the slums of Glasgow. There is not an equivalent of that in Wales or indeed in Catalonia. We of course have our own dialect, Lowlands or Doric, however you want to call it, which I think could, I mean, potentially become a language in the sense, you know, Dutch becomes a language apart from German, or even English becomes a language apart from German. But again, that would require an independent state. And I think it's something, going back to, we have to encourage that creation of a media which can really do that.
Okay, thank you very much. So we got some questions that were submitted by some of our members beforehand. So I'm going to ask one now, which we were sort of talking about a little bit in the preamble. But so how do you feel when you see both Wales and Scotland, well, apologies, Chris, do so well at the Euros as competing as nations, when this is denied to Catalonia or the Basques?
Chris, you're welcome to go on this first. I don't want to keep on going first. You're welcome.
Okay. I mean, first thing to say, I think what's really interesting is the Scots have done a very neat trick, which is reinvent themselves. For those with long memories will remember back in the 1970s or 1980s, Scottish football fans were sort of branded as hooligans, rampaging onto the pitch at Wembley, taking down the goalposts and all the rest of it. One of the consequences of this is they've kind of reinvented themselves as being party animals who, you know, this week, last Friday, there were tens of thousands of Scots in London. They were well behaved, they were having a good time, they were drinking a bit too much, but they weren't out for trouble. They were out to have fun, and actually they knew that they expected they were going to get beaten by England, and the 0-0 result was a bit of a surprise to them and a bit of a victory. But I think that's quite important, and it heralds something else which I just want to say, which is, in terms of Scottish identity, it reflects something which has changed. When I was a kid, the Scottish identity was very militaristic. The Edinburgh Tattoo, for instance, you know, very associated with the sort of Scottish regiments. And it was very associated with Calvinism, the state religion, Presbyterianism. That has fundamentally changed in the course of my lifetime. The swings no longer get locked up as they were in Edinburgh at midnight. Sorry, on the Saturday night, so you can't be out playing on a Sunday, the Sabbath. And now you have this much more open, European, multiracial, multicultural identity of Scotland. And I know this as well from the marches in Wales, the same thing happening. Welcoming people from the different communities that make up our nation now. And for me, it was epitomized by the decision in 2014, a decision made by the Scottish government, that the people who got a vote in the referendum were the people who lived in Scotland. In other words, the Scots are the people who live there. Doesn't matter where they come from. It doesn't matter skin color. It doesn't matter religion. They are the people who live there. And I think that's a tremendous thing. And I think it's something we can, and I know it's something which is happening now in Wales, exactly the same phenomenon. You know, we are striving to become a modern nation. We don't have the food and the weather of Catalonia, but in many ways, Catalonia actually does provide an example for us, because they are doing exactly the same thing. A modern, looking forward nation, not hampered by nationalism. And this is, I'm speaking too long, but this is one of the things that's never talked about. The real bogey is British and Spanish nationalism, which is never talked about. That's the bogey in the room, which has done terrible damage around the globe. And to try and pretend that Catalan, Welsh, or Scottish nationalism is somehow equal to that is just farcical.
I agree so much with what Chris was just saying, just on that final point, that I also feel really, I don't like the term nationalist, but it's again because of associations from elsewhere. I consider myself to be an internationalist, but they have, I think there's a crucial distinction between civic nationalism and ethnic nationalism, yes. Whereas British nationalism is all about ethnic nationalism, and that's what fueled Brexit. It was kind of like an, oh, keep it for us, close the borders. Whereas civic nationalism wants to open up borders, for goodness sake, and whoever happens to be living in Wales or in Scotland, then guys, you're part of it. It's not, we don't care where you were born. If you've chosen to live your lives here, we want you. But in terms of the football, I think that, yeah, I agree with what Chris was saying again, that it's interesting in Wales. Wales in the south, so where I'm from, it tends to be more about rugby. And oddly, the rugby has always, I'm not quite sure how, but the rugby is seen as kind of daffodil nationalism. And that term means that people will kind of sing the anthem and be really excited when they've got their rugby shirt on when Wales are playing England, but every other day of the year they don't care. Somehow the Welsh football team has been able to tap into something different. There's actually quite a large group of supporters called Welsh Football Fans for Independence, and they go on their little mini marches the night before marches and everything before the games. So I think it's because in Wales, it's partly because the Welsh football team has embraced the Welsh language. Their Twitter handle is @Cymru. That is the Welsh football official Twitter account. It's @Cymru, which is the Welsh word for Wales. So I think it's partly about embracing a sense of being grassroots, built by the fans, rather than being seen as an establishment thing.
Thank you. Okay, and I mean, just as a sort of follow on from that, I guess from the Catalan perspective and Basque, they never have the opportunity to have that team. How would you feel as a Welsh person or as a Scottish person if you only had to support a British team?
Well, actually, at this point, yes, forgive me, I meant to say that, Mike. I think that there's been an MP in Westminster and possibly also an article in The Spectator or in one of the right-wing newspapers. Someone was saying, why is there a Welsh team and a Scottish team? There should be a British team. And, you know, I think that the first ever international football game was between England and Scotland, so they've got no idea of the history or anything of this. But actually, yeah, I guess for lots of different reasons, the idea of there being different teams, it's just a tradition that we have it. Thank goodness we do. I suppose that the way that Catalan fans will feel about football will be not the same, but maybe comparable in some way to how I feel about the Olympics, that there's just Team GB, whereas if you in the Commonwealth Games that we're allowed to compete just as well. So I wouldn't feel an affinity with the British team. That is not against England. I'm in no way anti-English. It's just that that's not part of my identity because of all the complications. But yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and I think that's common. My wife certainly doesn't shout for Spain during these competitions. Okay, so if I can ask one specifically for Chris, if that's okay, from one of our members. So Catalonia's independence movement has been very hindered by party politics, rivalries, and disunity. How big an issue has this also been in Scotland, do you think?
I don't think, until recently, it really wasn't a particular problem. It has emerged much more so because of the infighting which developed around Alex Salmond and then eventually the launch of a new party, Alba, which didn't do well in the elections, largely because it was launched too late to make an impact. But that has caused some of the difficulties that we are seeing between, as in Catalonia. So I think in one sense, having one independence party is a strength. It's also a weakness because I think in Catalonia you get a spectrum. So if, for instance, you're on the radical left, you can support the coup. If you're social democratic, you can support the Esquerra. If you're maybe consider yourself more in the middle of the road, you might support Junts. That's a bit unfair on them, but I don't think they are. I think they share a social democratic platform largely as well. And I think that's true in the Basque Country, where you can vote for the PNV or you can vote for Bildu, the new left-wing pro-independence party. And I think that in some ways is quite good because it allows the independence movement to attract a spectrum of people. So I'll just leave it there. Having one main independence party has strengths, but it has weaknesses, and we've seen some of the weaknesses, I think, in recent weeks and months. You need to unmute.
Sorry. Next question for Delyth, please. From one of our members, what do you see happening first, Wales becoming independent or Ireland reunited?
Oh, well, it's like what Chris was saying earlier, that there seem to be so many different, I don't know if the metaphor would work, that there are lots of dominoes that could fall at the same time. That metaphor doesn't work, but you know what I mean. I wonder, because of course, when Chris and I are talking about what's happening in Scotland, what's happening in Wales, the situation in Ireland is so much more fraught and dangerous. And I remember being, actually when I worked in Westminster, so it was a decade ago now, before all of this awful, the tensions have been stoked up even more by the hard Brexit that we have. I'd gone to a presentation where people were talking about independence from the different parts of the UK, and the Welsh presentation, the person was really excited, and the Scottish presentation, the person was even more excited and kind of frustrated that it wasn't happening already. And the person from Northern Ireland was just talking about, I think the name of the presentation was Ennui and Frustration. That was the title of the presentation. And I think because of events outside of anyone's well, no, I was going to say outside of anyone's control. No, they're completely within the control of the Westminster government, who have just didn't care about the impact that their hard Brexit would have on the lives, the life and death situation in Northern Ireland. They just didn't care. And I think because of that, I certainly think that Irish reunification I think it's a matter of time. In terms of which one will happen first, I mean, I would suspect that Scottish independence would happen before either. And that Irish unification, well, when Scottish independence happens, because Ireland is a slightly separate issue, but when Scotland happens, the union in many people's eyes, at least, will be Wales and England. And a union of just Wales and England wouldn't work. There is no equivalent anywhere in the world for a federation or anything where you've got one partner who dwarfs the other so much. So I think and that's why I was saying in my contribution earlier, I don't want what happens in Wales to happen by default just because of what happens elsewhere. That is in no way against, I'm so excited by what's happening in Scotland. And I can't say I'm excited by Ireland because it's such a fraught and awful situation. But I feel, but I want the right thing to happen for the peoples of all of these nations. It's just that what happens in Ireland, because of Boris Johnson and his government, I worry about what will happen, what will lead to it happening, how many deaths there will need to be. I just think the road there is going to be very difficult. Chris has got his hand up.
Yes. Go for it, Chris.
I think this raises a very interesting question. I agree with what Delyth is saying, but I think it also raises what an independent Scotland would have a job globally in addressing what the Scots have done. And in Ireland, that is a major question. And it's not about full apologies like Tony Blair gave for the 1841 famine. We would have to seriously address what Scotland's record is in Ireland, in the settlement of Ulster, in the sectarianism which blighted Scotland in the 19th and 20th century. And it's, I was born in a city, the capital city, Edinburgh, there were still Protestant Action Councillors. The Conservatives stood as the Unionist Party. They weren't referring to the Union of Scotland and England. They were referring to the Union of the United Kingdom and Ireland. And that sectarianism impacted badly on Scottish society. It largely flowed, and actually it's quite interesting, the very first Orange Lodge in Scotland came from yeomanry who returned from suppressing the 1798 rebellion. It was connected to what Scotland was doing there. And I think in independent Scotland, it'd have to be a chance for us to address what we did in terms of the slave trade, what we did across the globe, in India and elsewhere. And I don't see that ever happening in the British state. The best you would get is that sort of Tony Blair apology for the Irish family. The reality is more the Windrush generation. The reality is that immigration raid we saw in Glasgow stopped by an outpouring of people in Govan Hill blocking it. We need an independent Scotland and independent Wales to address what we have done across the globe. And with the song I would regard as my favourite for a Scottish national anthem, Freedom Come All You, the singer and poet Hamish Henderson exactly says that. You know, nae mair way Harry lands, nae mair way Harry Quackens, people will not be sailing down the broomy water war. He had a vision of an independent Scotland, free from that colonial legacy, free from the legacy of empire.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. That's very interesting. Thank you. And we've got a question from Alan Collins. If I've unmuted you, if you want to talk.
Thank you. This is for either or both, whoever wants to answer this. I know that they didn't come up with the idea, but obviously the British government do seem to be keen on promoting this One Britain, One Nation Day, and schools holding events about Britishness tomorrow. I don't know a great deal about it because, quite frankly, I'm completely disinterested. But when I started hearing about it, it sort of brought back memories of the education minister in Spain a few years ago wanting to españolizar schools across Spain, particularly in regions like Catalonia and the Basque Country. I mean, realistically, how much sway do you think events and pushes like that, either within the education system or without, have on how an individual would view their own nationality?
Perhaps you could just explain as well for people who are not intimate with the British news what this is all, what the One Britain thing is all about.
So from my understanding, it was started by a gentleman up in West Yorkshire a few years ago who wanted to instill a sense of pride in Britishness, but it's sort of really been picked up this year by the Department for Education, and there is a song which has been written by primary school students that the government is encouraging all students to sing in school.
I mean, it's essentially propaganda, isn't it? And I think the Welsh government have said that it should not be happening in schools in Wales. If I could just go quickly on this first, Chris, because I'm sure you'll have opinions on this as well. I see it, well, it is propaganda. I see it as an equivalent to what the UK government has been trying to do with flags recently. So for people who are not familiar with this, the UK government has, especially since Brexit, since we've left the EU, the UK government has been encouraging putting up the Union Jack, the Union flag, in Wales and in Scotland to try and force an identity onto people. The idea of a flag, and it links into what you were saying, Alan, that the idea of a flag or the idea of a celebratory song, if it is enforced, it's no longer a celebration, it's no longer a badge of pride, it becomes something quite sinister. So I'm sure that the Yorkshireman who came up with the idea, I'm sure it was not in any way a sinister thing. It only becomes sinister when a government tries to enforce it on people. And I think using school children as propaganda machines is quite, I can't think of a better word than sinister. I just think it's a really quite ugly thing to do. So I can't see it really working because you can't force it. I mean, obviously it could have an unplugged. I haven't heard the song. I've deliberately not put the volume on Twitter when I've seen it being shared because so many people have said it's actually really catchy and I don't want to get it in my head. For my sins, I was a school governor, and we had a thing called the Respect Agenda, which was we were under legal obligation to monitor primary school children in case of any Islamic radicalization, and to check out their parents and stuff like this. It's no joke. But one of the things was schools were given the mandate that they had to teach British values. When I was at a meeting to discuss this, I asked what these particular values were: slavery, colonialism,
you know, what were we going to teach of British values? And I think if anyone was seriously going to answer that question, they'd be struggling to deal with it. But obviously, there's normal things anyone would say, you know, being polite and things like that. But what are those British values, and what are we celebrating here? And I think your question is a very good one by drawing a parallel with Spain, because, you know, Spain has, you know, flying in the center of Madrid, the biggest Spanish flag in the world, put up by a Popular Party government. It has regular army days. It still has a Hispanic day. They changed the title from Christopher Columbus because it didn't play well in Latin America. They still incidentally have ceremonies to commemorate the Blue Division, the Francoist volunteers who fought with the Nazi army in Russia. Fairly incredible, but they still do that. There's a plethora of these things, and you know, we really do not want to be going down that road, because there's an authoritarianism there. And what it led to in Spain in the autumn of 2017 was shocking scenes in Huelva and Andalusia of people cheering the Guardia Civil on their way to Catalonia to stop the referendum. Now, I just ask you, in Andalusia, the Guardia Civil were literally created to suppress rural unrest. They carried out massacres in the 1920s, 1930s of landless laborers who'd taken over the land, etc. They were battening down the Indienago protesters against austerity. What are these people thinking cheering on the Guardia Civil? This is the mindset you get into, because they need to remember what those people did to their ancestors, but also have a think about it. If the Guardia Civil are beating people up in Barcelona trying to vote, well, they are going to do the exact same tactics in Huelva, Sevilla, and Madrid against people protesting against you know, lack of public spending, whatever it is. So we do not want to get into this mindset.
Yeah, it's quite shocking to see in British context, I think. Okay, so we're coming towards the end. So I'm just going to ask, I think, one final question that we had, which is for both Chris and for Delyth. So do either of you see a long-term path to a future union of smaller nations in a truly federal Europe and a weakening of the power of big states? What trends do you see now that might provide encouragement to this vision?
Chris is probably going to be far more eloquently well-read then, if that's a phrase, on this. So I would defer to his expertise in terms of trends. But I certainly think that not only is there a possible future, surely that is the only future that is sustainable. I think that the world is becoming smaller in so many different ways, and small is beautiful. You know, I think that small nations can thrive. As I said earlier, I am an internationalist, and I think that my dream certainly is that Wales, as an independent nation, would rejoin the EU with Scotland, and I hope that will also happen for Ireland. But I think, and I also think that will benefit England. I think that the crisis of English identity is going to that's a whole other kettle of fish. But I think it's going to, that is something that that the nation of England will have to come to terms with, because I think that the reason why British nationalism it can be so ugly is because there is a vacuum in the sense of what it is to be English. I mean, there's so many things that the people should be able to celebrate about being English, but they are hampered by so much baggage. And so I think that when the vision that you're setting up, Mike, when that happens, I would hope that would be good. Well, maybe there should be a breakup of England into component, smaller parts. I'm sure there'll be. So I mean, certainly, maybe on Cairn I would want that to happen. So Cornwall would want that to happen. But yeah, I will defer to Chris's expertise because he probably knows far more about the trends and how likely this is to happen.
Thank you, Delyth.
Well, of course, I mean, the problem here is that there are various national movements, which I wouldn't want to touch that barge for in Europe. I mean, I'm thinking of the Lega, formed by the Lega Nord in Italy, which began as anti-Southerners. I mean, this is a sort of national we don't want to involve, and I think we all agree in that. We really don't want to touch that with a barge pole. However, it's also clear to me that one of the dangers is, in terms of Brexit, is of course Scotland voted to stay in the EU. We should respect that. But there is a danger of just becoming an EU fan club and not ignoring what is going on. The silence over Catalonia, the way it treated Greece and the other southern European economies and Ireland during the fallout from the financial crash, and so on. Its inability to intervene in things like France, where they've just scrapped this law, which gave some rights to the minority languages which existed in France. So I think we do need. I agree with this. I think I'm a European. Right? Doesn't necessarily mean that the EU is what I would want as a perfect solution. I would like to see a Europe of where all nations are treated with the same respect, all nations have the same rights, and their culture and language are celebrated. And I think that also touches on something else. I was reading a Scottish historian who points out if you turn the map of Britain the other way around, what becomes obvious is there are some, particularly for Scotland, there are some obvious connections which we would want to recreate, which we had with the Arctic, Scandinavia, the Baltic, Ireland, the Isle of the Irish Sea becomes not an obstacle, but it becomes a trade route. Wales. We need to start already recalibrating where we want to be in the world, and Scandinavia is a very good example, and I think this is beginning to happen. We're building up good links. We have good links with Catalonia. We're beginning to develop links with the Basques. We've got some links with Quebecois across the Atlantic. These are important. And I think it also begs the question, if I may, about what's happening in Spain, because I think one of the problems the Catalans have is with this rise of Spanish nationalism, which infects the PSOE, the Socialist Party as well. What exists on the Spanish left has failed to defend the rights of the Catalans to self-determination. They don't need to support independence, but it's a democratic right to decide the future. Podemos really, I think, bottled it in terms of coming out in the support for that. I think there's a job that needs to be done in Spain. The Catalans need to build a support network, and it's not that easy, but I think it has to be done. I think we need to build a support network in England among Democrats who are prepared to support our right to self-determination. And I think there is actually a growing number of people who sympathise with the desire of the Welsh and the Scots to get out of the UK. Many people articulate it quite, that they'd love to go to Scotland. So I think we need to do that, and we need to build links. I was rather sad to see a sort of a stramash between Andy Burnham, the mayor of Manchester, and the Scottish government, because actually we should be building links with people like Andy Burnham in Manchester, because they're potential allies of us. I'm not saying support independence, he probably wouldn't, but we can build connections with them. So I'm giving a long reply in terms of that, but I think it's a job of work to be done. And I may say the chair of the all-party group at Westminster, Delyth Hill-Williams, we have attended meetings in Brussels with people in the European Parliament, with people from across Europe, from the different countries and nations. The Catalans took that initiative. I think it was an excellent initiative, and I hope, maybe one of the things we could take from this is the idea of the foreign friends of Catalonia. I know welcome people to the Diada, but one of the things we could think of once we get escaped this pandemic is building on that to have some sort of assembly in Catalonia. I prefer it there rather than Wales and Scotland because the food's better and the weather's better. But if we could come together with other people from across Europe to discuss our vision of what we want and the Europe we want.
Count me in for that.
Yeah, no, and I think honestly that the way Foreign Friends is moving is to broaden out now a little bit more than just within Catalonia, but in general, fighting for human rights and self-determination in all circumstances, and definitely we're very open to that idea of linking up with like-minded people, really, and particularly, I think as you said, Chris, and Delyth, there is a kind of a badge of nationalism which has a particular association, but it's very clear that the kind of Catalan independence movement and the Welsh independence movement and the Scottish independence movement, and of course there are others in Canada and Quebec and so on, you know, there are different they are socially progressive and so on. And I think that's what we're trying to, you know, trying to broaden and be part of that big conversation, hopefully. Well, thank you very much. Really, really appreciate your time and your energy and your passion and everything you've brought to this, Chris and Delyth. Really, really appreciate it. And I think I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say it's been a very enjoyable session, and you'd be welcome back anytime, obviously, and also, you know, we will try and make something happen in Catalonia where we can all meet up. So finally, if I could just ask everyone just to give a big round of applause to Delyth and Chris. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Diolch yn fawr
Thank
iawn.
you.
Lyfli to meet you.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Adeo.
Thank you.
Gracias. Gracias.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you. Bye.